The equipment salesman walked up to a young man at a rural auction and said a short sentence that would echo in that man's mind for years. He told him the machines he had just bought were worthless and that he had thrown his money away. The salesman had no idea that moment would later come back to him in a way he would never forget. A decade later, the same young man would stand in the salesman's office and say something that would leave the room silent. But that moment only makes sense if you understand how it all began. In early spring of 1973, a 26-year-old farmhand named Daniel Harper stood near the edge of a local auction yard. He watched as an elderly farmer's entire life was sold off item by item. There were no children to take over the land, no relatives interested in keeping the operation going. Everything had to be sold. Daniel had spent 8 years working for his uncle, doing hard labor and saving every dollar he could. He did not spend money unless he had to. By the time of that auction, he had $12,000 to his name. It was not enough to impress anyone, but it was enough to give him a chance if he was careful. The auction moved slowly through household clutter, worn tools, and equipment nobody wanted. Most people were there waiting for something newer or more impressive. Then the auctioneer reached the tractors. 2 old red machines sat off to the side, faded and scarred by decades of use. One was built in the early 50s, the other in the mid-50s. Their paint was dull, rust showed through in spots, and oil stains darkened the metal. To most of the crowd, they looked like relics from another era. To Daniel, they looked like opportunity. The auctioneer announced that the older tractor still ran well and only needed cosmetic attention. He asked for an opening bid that drew nothing but silence. Nobody raised a hand. When the price dropped lower and lower, the quiet only grew heavier. Finally, Daniel lifted his arm and made a modest offer. A few people chuckled under their breath. The auctioneer hesitated, clearly surprised, but no one else spoke up. Within moments, the tractor was sold to Daniel for a fraction of what it once cost. The second tractor followed the same path. Daniel placed a slightly higher bid, and again, nobody challenged him. In less than an hour, he owned 2 machines that most people considered useless. As Daniel was loading up his purchases, a man in his 40s approached him. He wore clean clothes, polished boots, and carried himself with the confidence of someone used to giving advice. He worked as a sales manager at a large equipment dealership in town and made his living convincing farmers to buy newer machines. He recognized Daniel and struck up a conversation, quickly turning his attention to the tractors. He dismissed them with a wave of his hand and warned Daniel that they were outdated, inefficient, and a waste of money. He told him that parts would be hard to find and that serious farmers invested in modern equipment. Daniel listened without interrupting. When the man finished, Daniel calmly said that the tractors ran and that was enough for him. The salesman insisted that it was not enough if Daniel wanted to succeed, explaining that growth required efficiency and financing. Daniel replied that financing also meant debt, and debt was exactly what he wanted to avoid. The salesman shook his head and told Daniel that he would never truly own anything farming that way. He predicted that within 5 years the tractors would be useless and Daniel would have nothing to show for his effort. Before leaving, he told Daniel to come see him when he was ready to farm seriously. Daniel drove home with his 2 tractors and a quiet resolve. He was not angry. He was focused. What the salesman did not realize was that Daniel was not just trying to get by with old equipment. He was determined to prove that a different way of farming was possible. He believed that ownership mattered more than appearances and that avoiding debt was the key to long-term security. He intended to build something with what he had, even if everyone else thought it was foolish. For 2 years, Daniel had been watching a neglected piece of land outside town. It was 160 acres of sandy soil with drainage problems and little appeal. The price had dropped several times because no one wanted to take on the work. Daniel finally made an offer with a modest down payment and agreed to finance the rest over 20 years. When the seller accepted, Daniel moved onto the land with little more than determination. The house was small, the barn was barely standing, and there was no modern infrastructure to speak of. After buying the land and the tractors, Daniel had just $2,000 left to cover everything until harvest. His uncle tried to talk him out of it, warning him that he was taking on too much with too little. Daniel listened and then said he needed to try. He understood the risk, but he also understood that it was his only chance to do things his way. He spent the first month rebuilding the tractors himself, replacing worn parts and fixing leaks. The cost was minimal because he did the labor. By planting season, both machines were running reliably. That year, Daniel planted corn and soybeans using borrowed equipment, which he later paid for with labor. All summer, he worked alone. The tractors were slow and inefficient by modern standards, but they ran every day. While neighbors finished fields in a couple of days, Daniel took nearly a week. Speed did not matter to him. Avoiding debt did. He lived without electricity for months, cooked on a wood stove, and cut his own firewood. People in town whispered that he would fail, that the tractors would break down, and that he was living in the past. When harvest came, the yields were modest but acceptable. After selling his crops and paying expenses, Daniel cleared $8,000. He used half of it to make extra payments on his land and saved the rest. He had survived his first year. The salesman heard about it and decided to visit. He looked around at the simple setup and told Daniel he was wasting his youth living that way. Daniel replied that he was living without debt on land that belonged to him. The salesman argued that Daniel could be doing more if he upgraded. Daniel asked why it mattered so much to him. The question ended the conversation. The next few years tested Daniel in every way. A drought cut his yields, forcing him to take a winter job just to stay afloat. Other years brought better weather and better prices. Slowly, he added equipment bought at auctions and rebuilt by hand. Each piece reduced his reliance on others. He diversified his crops to improve cash flow. Every extra dollar went toward paying down his land. The salesman crossed paths with Daniel again and again, often reminding him that he was still using outdated machines. Each time, Daniel calmly pointed out that he was paying off his land while others were still paying off equipment. By the 7th year, even skeptics began to admit that Daniel was making it work. Good seasons allowed him to pay off multiple years at once. His remaining debt shrank steadily. 10 years after that auction, Daniel made his final land payment. He was 36 years old and owned his farm outright. His total investment in equipment over that decade was a small fraction of what many others had financed. While others were still tied to monthly payments, Daniel owed nothing. He owned his land, his equipment, and his future. The next day, he walked into the same dealership where he had once been dismissed. He told the salesman that his land was paid off. The salesman was stunned and asked how he had done it. Daniel explained simply that he lived modestly, avoided unnecessary purchases, fixed what he owned, and kept his money working for him instead of against him. The salesman admitted he had underestimated him. Daniel replied that he had underestimated what truly mattered. Daniel never rushed to upgrade. The old tractors kept running, year after year. He farmed that land for decades, eventually buying more acreage with cash. When he retired, he owned everything outright. One of those old tractors still sat in his shed, maintained and functional, a quiet reminder of a decision everyone else had mocked. Years later, when asked if he ever doubted himself, Daniel admitted that he did, especially during the hardest times. What kept him going was his commitment to the plan and his belief in the numbers. He knew that ownership came from patience, not speed. He hoped to pay off his land in 10 years and planned for 20. Reaching that goal felt like winning something far greater than money. Daniel's story is not about machines or pride. It is about understanding that building something solid often means ignoring advice that sounds smart but does not serve your goals. He proved that ownership matters more than appearances and that patience can outlast skepticism. In the end, the tractors that were called worthless helped secure a lifetime of independence. As the years passed, Daniel settled into a rhythm that suited him. He never chased trends or worried about keeping up with what others thought a successful farm should look like. His days were long, quiet, and steady. He fixed fences, rotated crops, and kept his machines running with careful maintenance instead of replacement. When something broke, He studied it, took it apart, and learned how it worked. That knowledge became as valuable to him as any piece of equipment he owned. While others relied on service calls and financing plans, Daniel relied on his hands and his patience. People slowly stopped questioning him. Some still disagreed with his choices, but the tone changed. It was no longer mockery. It was curiosity. Younger farmers began stopping by, asking how he managed to stay afloat without loans. Daniel never lectured them. He simply explained what he did and why it worked for him. He told them that simplicity was not about going backward, but about choosing what actually mattered. He admitted the lifestyle was not easy and that comfort often had to wait, but he also made it clear that the peace of owning everything outright was worth the sacrifice. Over time, Daniel improved the land itself. He worked on drainage, rebuilt the barn piece by piece, and slowly upgraded the house as money allowed. Each improvement was paid for in cash. There were no shortcuts and no sudden expansions. When neighboring land came up for sale years later, he waited until he could afford it without risk. That patience allowed him to grow without fear of losing what he had already built. His operation remained modest in size but strong in foundation. The old tractors became part of the landscape. They were not symbols of stubbornness anymore. They were proof that care and consistency could stretch the life of almost anything. When one finally reached the end of its useful life decades later, Daniel did not feel regret. He felt gratitude. That machine had done its job and more. It had helped secure land, stability, and independence. He replaced it carefully, the same way he had always done, with something affordable and paid for outright. By the time Daniel stepped away from daily farming, he had achieved something many never do. He retired without fear of bills or banks. The land was his. The equipment was his. The decisions were his. He passed the farm on to family members who understood the philosophy behind it, not just the methods. They did not see old equipment as a limitation, but as a tool, no different from any other, as long as it worked. Looking back, Daniel never claimed his way was the only way. He understood that every situation was different. But he stood by one belief without hesitation. Ownership brings a kind of freedom that cannot be measured on a balance sheet. It allows mistakes without panic and slow progress without pressure. It rewards discipline in ways that are not always obvious at first. The lesson from Daniel's story is simple and uncomfortable for many. Progress does not always mean newer or bigger. Sometimes it means quieter, slower, and less impressive on the surface. The voices that told him he was doing it wrong were confident and convincing, but time proved something else. In the end, it was not the opinions of others that shaped his success. It was his willingness to trust his plan, endure doubt, and let patience do the work. In the years after Daniel stepped back from full-time work, the farm took on a different kind of life. It was no longer a test of survival or proof of a point. It became a place of continuity. The routines he had built did not disappear when his pace slowed. They carried on through habits passed down, through quiet mornings and steady seasons. The land responded to that consistency. Fields that once struggled now produced reliably. Structures that had nearly collapsed stood firm after years of careful repair. Daniel spent more time observing than doing. He walked the property often, noticing small changes most people overlooked. He paid attention to soil texture, water movement, and how crops reacted to subtle shifts in weather. That awareness came from decades of being directly involved in every step. Nothing about the operation had ever been distant from him. He knew it too well for that. The farm was not a business abstraction. It was something he understood deeply because he had earned that understanding one day at a time. Occasionally, people still asked him if he ever felt he missed out by not upgrading sooner or expanding faster. Daniel would smile and say he never felt behind. He believed rushing created pressure, and pressure led to decisions made for the wrong reasons. He had watched neighbors grow quickly only to struggle when markets turned or repairs piled up. Some made it through. Others did not. Daniel never took pleasure in that. It only reinforced what he already believed, that stability mattered more than scale. What surprised him most was how often people outside farming related to his story. Tradespeople, small business owners, and even office workers told him they felt trapped by payments and expectations. They saw something familiar in his choices. Daniel always reminded them that his path required trade-offs. Comfort came later. Recognition barely came at all. But peace arrived early, long before success looked impressive from the outside. As time went on, the story of the auction and the warning from the salesman became something people retold with a sense of irony. Daniel never exaggerated it and never framed it as revenge. To him, it was simply a moment that clarified what he valued. Being doubted did not fuel him nearly as much as being clear-headed. He did not succeed to prove someone wrong. He succeeded because he stayed aligned with what he believed would last. Even now, when the machinery starts up in the shed and the fields are worked using methods that favor care over speed, there is a quiet confidence behind it. Nothing flashy. Nothing rushed. Just the steady result of choices made long ago and honored consistently. The land stands as proof, not of stubbornness, but of patience rewarded. Daniel's life did not become a headline or a legend in his own time. It became something more durable. It became an example that success does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it simply shows up year after year, paid for, standing firm, and answering to no one.